All right, so now we're coming into the second trade opportunity, and this one, in my opinion, is a little bit easier to make money on than maybe the earnings trade, although fewer people will apply the straddle or the strangle to this trade. So let me show you what I'm talking about. It's the Bollinger squeeze. Now, we talk about this trade setup a lot in our foundations classes and some of the other classes where we look at this thing, but rarely do I talk about it with the strangle or the straddle. So let me talk about that here. With the Bollinger squeeze, again, you know that a breakout is coming soon. Pretty much with all straddles, you know a breakout's coming. Otherwise, don't do it because you'll lose money on it. But in the Bollinger squeeze, the earnings play, all these, you know a breakout's coming soon. Problem is, again, you don't know which way it's coming, so there's some uncertainty there. This creates a great strangle opportunity. And again, notice I specified strangle here. I'll underline it, strangle. I prefer on the Bollinger squeeze to use a strangle. You could use the straddle on the Bollinger squeeze. It's going to cost you a little bit more. The truth is, it's probably more situational. If the squeeze is right in the middle of where a straddle would work better, then great. But normally the strangle is going to work better because you're going to be in it for a little bit longer. You want to pay as little as you can for the premium, and you know once the squeeze breaks one way or the other, it's going to be a big move. So usually the straddle is going to be the ideal setup here for the Bollinger squeeze. Now you do have an additional benefit here with the Bollinger squeeze, unlike with the earnings play. With the earnings play, remember, implied volatility gets sucked out of the trade. With the Bollinger squeeze, it's the opposite. Look here. You got the added benefit that usually implied volatility is low. That's the whole point of the squeeze. The squeeze happens because the volatility of the stock has come down. It's contracted. It's gone sideways for a while. Well, the implied volatility starts to come out as well. Then you get into this Bollinger squeeze. When the Bollinger squeeze expands, what happens to volatility? It goes back up as well. So volatility is going to go up as the squeeze breaks rather than going down. With the earnings trade, volatility is coming down. That hurts your option price. With the Bollinger squeeze, implied volatility is typically going up. That helps your option price. Consequently, this gives actually more opportunity for you to make money with this trade. I've actually done a couple of these where even the losing leg did not lose money simply because the implied volatility came up so much. So this is a better, in my opinion, more consistent way of using the straddle or the strangle trade. Take a look over here at the example that I've got on the screen here. This is for Apple Computer. And look at the nice squeeze that we've got set up here. So this has actually been squeezing for a while. We went from June all the way into October. And look at how this has really started to flatline here. You're really getting tight, within a $4 range. And we're there for a couple of weeks. And you say, this thing's about to break out. So you go buy yourself a $95 put. You spend a couple dollars on that, about $205. You buy a $105 call, spend about $1.45 on that. And so now you're into this trade for $3.50. And the way I come up with that, in case you're not tracking with me, you add $1.45, that's for the call, and $2.05, that's for the put. That gives you $3.50 there. Okay, so that's your total cost of this trade. You're going to have to come up with $3.50 per share. Now, in order to break even, where are you going to break even? In order to break even, you need to have, at expiration, if you hold it that long, you need to have at least $3.50 of intrinsic value. So if your strike price is 105, you need this stock to go to at least 108.50. Why? Because 108.50 is $3.50 above your strike price. That way you know you're breaking even at expiration. If this trade breaks bearish, you need to add or subtract, I should say, $3.50 from $95. So that puts you at $91.50. You know that this trade has to come down at least to $91.50. That's where you would break even. Now, if you don't hold it to expiration, you can actually not have to be that far and still make a profit. But if you're going to hold it that long, you've got to be at least far enough in the money on the winning side to offset both your premiums for the call and for the put on this trade. Now, let's watch what happened with this trade. Look at that. It turned out that it broke to the upside. In fact, it started to break to the downside. Look at that. So it started to break to the downside. Had you had a trigger in here, if you had a trigger, let's say at 97.50 to say get into this trade if I drop below 97.50, you would have been buying puts, and immediately within 3 trading sessions, this thing turned around and it took off to the upside. This is what we call a false break, false Bollinger squeeze break. And this trade setup, when it happens, it's usually really profitable on the other side. but you wouldn't have known that if you were just trading this with a trigger. So what the benefit here of getting the straddle, or in this case the strangle in here, is even though it started to break to the bearish side, gave you the head fake, turned around, and looky here, $15 in 6 weeks. You had a great trade opportunity. Remember, our cost on this was how much? $3.50 was all our cost was on this trade. So $3.50 was the cost for both the call and the put, and you made $15 on it. You take that out. What's your profit on this trade? $11.50. So you're doing pretty well in this trade, right? You had a really great reward to risk ratio. You held the trade for a couple weeks. Notice we were in it for a little bit longer. We're not in this overnight like we are with the earnings trade. We're in this for a little bit longer. You're going to buy a little bit more time in your options, and you're going to ride with that wave, oftentimes up to expiration. In a perfect world, you get out a couple weeks before expiration, but sometimes it doesn't make sense to do that, so you're going to have to take that on a situational scenario. But this is the way that trade would work out. And again, it would be very profitable for you. Now, there's another bonus that happened in here. You ready for this? Take a look at the next screen. This was the same time frame. Let me come back and show you. Look at the chart here. This breakout happened. It started, the false break happened October 15th, but the real break happened the week before the first week of November, and then over the next 2 weeks in November. You see that there? While we're in this trade, look what happened to your implied volatility. Our implied volatility went up from 17%, first 2 weeks of November and on up into December here. We went up from 17% all the way up here, ultimately to 30%. But before this option would have expired, we'd only gone up to about 25%. So there's a 7 or 8 point swing in implied volatility, and you could have actually made a little bit more than what I showed you there, simply because your volatility is coming up and they're going to fluff up the premiums there on those options. So that's pretty cool, and that's one of the reasons I like doing the straddle or the strangle over a Bollinger squeeze, because a lot of times not only do you get the big breakout, you also get some implied volatility increase there, and that can really help you. Now, here's another idea. You can take this same setup and you can actually set it up in your favor. What if there was a time that you could do a Bollinger squeeze when you knew emphatically that the implied volatility was going to go up? Is there another time? There is a time, running up into earnings. So if you could time this thing just right, which you can because you know when the earnings calendar is going to be, if you go look at stocks that are maybe 6 to 8 weeks before earnings, and if you find a Bollinger squeeze about 6 to 8 weeks before earnings, guess what's going to happen? That Bollinger squeeze is going to break, and you know there's going to be a huge surge in implied volatility. I've done some of these trades and made money on both legs, even though one leg should be a losing trade. So here's how we do this thing. I call it the 1-2 punch. We've got a Bollinger squeeze. We're timing this so it's 6 to 8 weeks before earnings. Now, you can't control when the Bollinger squeeze happens, but you can search for stocks that are squeezing, compare it to the earnings calendar, and say, hey, this earnings is happening in 8 weeks. I see this thing's going to ramp up here over the next 8 weeks. This is a great time to get into this, get the 1-2 punch here. Get the squeeze breakout, and you have the potential for a huge implied volatility spike. And here's how we're going to do it. You ready? Make sure you buy this option that expires after earnings. Why do we want to make sure it expires after earnings? Well, if you buy the option that expires the week before earnings, no volatility spike will happen. You've got to get the one that happens after earnings. Remember, that implied volatility spike is happening to overcome the risk of holding over earnings, and so you want to ride it into earnings. Also, be sure to close the trade before earnings. So there's a few distinctions there. We're looking for a Bollinger squeeze 6 to 8 weeks before earnings. Buy the option that expires after earnings, but close it before earnings. You're going to get the 1-2 punch. You get the Bollinger squeeze breakout, and you get the implied volatility thrust, and it's a really consistent way to make some great money on this type of a trade.